The desert stretched endlessly, a barren expanse of cracked earth and dust-streaked rock, shimmering under a merciless sun. Heat waves danced off the sand, blurring the distant mountains into mirages. A SEAL chief, a man whose face carried decades of combat in every line, stood beside a Humvee, scanning the horizon. His body was taut, trained to detect movement, to anticipate danger even when there was none. Today, though, the danger wasn't the desert. It was the roster of incoming trainees, each claiming skills that would put seasoned operators to the test. Among the arrivals, one figure moved differently. She didn't rush. She didn't swagger. She walked with deliberate precision, each step measured, her boots kicking up clouds of dust that quickly dissolved into the sun's glare. Her uniform, standard tactical green, hugged a body that was deceptively strong. There was no frills, no overt show of power, just a quiet, undeniable presence that made heads turn. The chief's eyes narrowed as she approached, Barrett .50 sniper rifle slung over her back like it weighed nothing. He had seen plenty of rookies. Most were eager, overconfident, or just nervous messes. They stumbled with their rifles, struggled with recoil, or cringed under the desert sun. But her calm, it was unsettling. There was no hesitation in the way she adjusted her gear, no nervous glance around the range. It was as if she had walked out of some elite program the military hadn't even heard of, carrying experience far beyond her age, far beyond the typical training rotations. The chief's inner voice, a voice he relied on for survival in combat, spoke up. "Watch her closely. There's something about her, something off the charts." The other trainees unloaded their rifles, rattling brass on the hot metal tables, voices cracking in nervous laughter or false bravado. She didn't join them. She knelt by the Barrett, running her gloved fingers along the barrel, tracing the contours as though greeting an old friend. Her movements were deliberate, fluid, almost ritualistic. There was a reverence in the way she handled the machine, a respect that suggested years of intimate knowledge. The chief stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. "You've handled one of those before?" he asked, a hint of skepticism in his tone. Most newcomers struggled to lift the weapon. The recoil alone was enough to earn a few bruised egos. She glanced up, meeting his eyes with steady calm. "I've had some experience," she said, her voice low, measured. Not boastful, not defensive, just a fact. She adjusted her gloves, checked the scope, and then looked to the distant targets lined up at the far end of the range. 1,200 meters away, a distance that would make most marksmen swallow hard and curse their luck. The chief suppressed a laugh, shaking his head. This is the part where rookies panic. Yet as he watched her shoulder the Barrett, position her body, and peer through the scope, something in his chest shifted. She wasn't just confident, she was composed, surgical, like the desert had whispered its secrets to her and she had listened. A wind gusted across the range, kicking up dust into the air. She paused, scanning the horizon, calculating trajectory, wind drift, and the mirage dancing over the sand. Every movement precise, economical, no wasted motion. The chief had trained hundreds of snipers, men and women alike, and very few moved like this. Fewer still could maintain this level of calm under observation. The desert seemed to lean in, holding its breath. The targets awaited, inert and silent, yet pregnant with challenge. She exhaled slowly, adjusted the scope again, and then squeezed the trigger. The sound of the .50 caliber rifle cracking the air was deafening. The chief's ears rang, but his eyes were glued to the distant target. The steel plate at 1,200 meters shuddered, then rang with a crisp, echoing clang. Dead center. A murmur rippled through the range. The other trainees blinked in disbelief. The chief himself felt a jolt of recognition. This wasn't luck. This was execution, precision, mastery, and from a woman he had assumed was, at best, a competent novice. He stepped closer again, studying her posture. She lowered the rifle, brushing a wisp of hair from her face, completely unaffected by the attention she had drawn. Her breathing was steady, her expression calm, not a flicker of surprise, of pride, of doubt, only readiness. The chief's curiosity morphed into something sharper, respect tempered with caution. "Who are you?" he wanted to ask, but something told him he might not like the answer. She had the kind of focus that came from experience born in extremes, in situations where hesitation meant death. As the range officers called for the next set of shots, she adjusted her stance, shifted her weight, and reloaded with fluid efficiency. The other trainees fumbled with their weapons, dropping rounds or misaligning their sights, grumbling under their breath. She didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't acknowledge them. She was already in her zone, a world where only the rifle, the target, and her calculations existed. The chief leaned against the Humvee, arms crossed, eyes narrowing. "I need to know what she's done. I need to know how far this goes." And yet, even as he considered approaching her, a flicker of hesitation passed through his mind. Some truths aren't shared easily. Some skills are earned in shadows. A junior officer nudged him, whispering, "You've got to see the next shot. It's 1,500 meters now. Most of these guys won't even hit the steel at a kilometer." The chief followed her gaze to the further target, noticing the slight shimmer of heat over the sand that could blur the line between success and failure. Most men would curse the wind, curse the distance, curse their own limitations. Not her. She moved with the certainty of someone who had been here before, someone who had already danced with the impossible and lived. He watched, silent, as she recalculated angles, adjusted the scope for minute corrections, and exhaled a controlled breath. Then the shot cracked through the air, carrying farther than most ears could track, and the steel rang once again, almost taunting the desert itself. The chief's mind raced. Who was this woman? Where had she trained, survived, or operated to gain such skill? Every instinct in him, combat-honed instincts, urged caution. This isn't just skill. There's a story here, a history I need to uncover before I can even begin to understand her. As she lowered the rifle for the second time, the sun glinting off the barrel, the chief felt a mixture of disbelief and awe. She had arrived quietly, unassuming, yet she had just shattered every expectation he had ever held about what a trainee could accomplish. And he realized with a mixture of excitement and foreboding that this was only the beginning. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, shadows stretching long across the cracked earth, but the room seemed smaller somehow, contained in the tension between the SEAL chief and the woman who had just handled a Barrett .50 with more precision than most operators could dream of. The question that burned in his mind, and in the minds of everyone watching, was the same. Who was she, really, and what had led her to this moment? Because as the next challenge loomed, and the targets were moved even farther, everyone knew this was no ordinary day. Something extraordinary was about to unfold. The chief took a step back, silently acknowledging the unspoken truth. The desert had a new master, and she wasn't here to prove herself to anyone, but to show the world the impossible. And he realized, as the wind kicked up another cloud of dust, that he was about to witness a skill that would not just challenge him, but redefine the limits of what he thought was humanly possible. The targets had been moved farther, 500 meters, then 1,800. The desert sun now hung high, relentless, painting the sand in harsh, golden light. Heat waves warped the horizon, and every operator squinted against the glare, sweat streaming down their faces. Most trainees had already faltered, their rifles trembling in their hands, calculations off by inches that would become fatal at such distances. But she remained unshaken. The SEAL chief watched her step up, Barrett .50 rifle cradled in her arms as though it were a natural extension of her body. She crouched behind the barricade, elbows digging into the sand, scope rising to her eye like an artist lifting a brush. The desert stretched before her, miles of shimmering air and invisible obstacles. Every breath, every movement seemed perfectly synchronized. The chief had trained marksmen who could hit targets at a kilometer, maybe a kilometer and a half if conditions were perfect. But this was a whole other level. The thought flickered in his mind, unbidden and unsettling. She's not here to play, she's here to dominate. She adjusted the scope, her gloved fingers barely trembling as she factored in wind drift, mirage distortion, and subtle shifts in the desert air. Each adjustment seemed precise, deliberate. The chief felt the familiar tension in his chest, the tension of someone who has seen danger close, whose instincts are honed to the finest edge. This is a calculation of life and death, he realized. Even though it was only a range, he could feel the weight of it. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Then she exhaled slowly, the sound measured, almost ritualistic, and the rifle barked. The shot cracked the air with a thunderous report, echoing against the distant mountains. The steel target at 1,800 meters shuddered violently and rang with a sharp, clear clang that seemed impossibly precise. Dead center. Gasps and whispers erupted among the other trainees, their voices cracking in disbelief. Some staggered back as if physically struck. A few dropped to their knees, staring at the target as though the desert itself had performed a miracle. The chief's jaw tightened. He had been around sharpshooters who boasted about long-distance kills, some even claiming impossible feats, but few had ever actually delivered. And yet here she was, defying every law of distance and probability he had ever known. "Who trained you?" he asked under his breath, stepping closer, his voice a low growl. She lowered the rifle calmly, dusting off the barrel. "Mostly myself," she replied, almost dismissively, but her eyes told a different story, one of years spent perfecting skill under circumstances that most operators couldn't imagine. Her gaze shifted to the next target, 2,000 meters. Her breathing was steady, her mind already calculating every variable. The chief's hand itched to challenge her, to test her limits, but he also felt something he hadn't in years: anticipation. This wasn't just training, it was watching a prodigy in motion, a warrior who had honed her craft beyond conventional understanding. The wind shifted suddenly, a gust blowing dust into the sand and rippling the heat haze over the target. Most marksmen would have flinched, recalculated, cursed the conditions. Not her. She adjusted her aim imperceptibly, recalculated the parallax, and fired again. The shot landed, dead center. The steel clanged like a bell of impossibility. Around her the room erupted. Trainees stared in stunned silence, SEALs whispered among themselves, and the chief's eyes widened. Years of experience had taught him to separate ego from skill, but this shattered expectation entirely. He stepped closer, keeping his voice low. "You're hitting targets at what, 2,000 meters?" She shrugged, the corners of her mouth lifting in the faintest hint of a smile. "The distance isn't the point. Accuracy is. Everything else is just variables." Her words, calm and precise, only amplified the mystery. Who was this woman, and how had she gained mastery over a weapon most men struggled to wield even at half that distance? Her movements were almost inhumanly efficient, and the chief felt an uncomfortable realization settle over him. She wasn't just talented, she had survived situations that forced her to perfect skill to a lethal extreme. Then came the whispers among the trainees, rumors of a sniper capable of impossible feats, a girl with a record so unbelievable that most dismissed it as myth. The chief ignored the chatter, but a seed of curiosity had been planted. Could the stories be true? The next challenge was set, 2,500 meters. The targets were barely visible as tiny dots on the shimmering horizon. Most of the men around her cursed under their breath or shook their heads, knowing that at this distance, even slight miscalculations could mean total failure. She didn't move quickly. She crouched, scoped the far-off targets, and began calculating, her fingers tracing the adjustments on the rifle like a pianist finding the right notes. The chief noticed something others didn't. Her calmness wasn't arrogance. It was discipline forged in fire, in life-or-death scenarios he could only guess at. Seconds passed, minutes stretched. The desert seemed to hold its breath. She exhaled slowly, adjusted her aim one final time, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing across the mountains. A faint metallic clang answered back, dead center again. The chief's hands shook slightly, disbelief and respect mingling in a rare cocktail. He realized the rumors weren't just talk. This woman could, and had, done the impossible. He stepped forward. "How?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "Who taught you?" Her eyes met his, unwavering, calm, and almost haunting. "Necessity," she said softly. "And time, a lot of time." There was a shadow behind her words, a hint of history she wasn't ready to share. The chief didn't push. Experience had taught him that sometimes a warrior's past was a sealed vault, opened only when the timing was right. The trainees whispered among themselves, awestruck. One of the SEALs finally muttered, "I've seen a lot of snipers, but never like this." The chief nodded slowly, realizing he agreed, though the weight of it unsettled him. He had trained some of the most elite operators in the military, but watching her was like witnessing a paradigm shift. A single woman, handling a .50 caliber sniper rifle with the ease of a seasoned veteran, performing feats that defied probability. She lowered the rifle, scanning the horizon as though nothing had happened. Her calmness unnerved him almost as much as her skill. He realized that this was more than training, it was mastery, honed to a level that could change the course of operations in ways most could not imagine. And then, just as the chief began to process what he had witnessed, a younger trainee whispered, almost fearfully, "Did you hear about her? 3,247-meter shot." The words hit the chief like a shockwave. He froze. 3,247 meters. That wasn't just impressive. That was legendary, unreal. In a military context, almost impossible. He looked back at her, pretending to study her stance. Her expression gave nothing away, but the faint curve of her lips hinted at secrets he was not yet privy to. Something told him that this was only the beginning. Her history, her true capability, had yet to fully reveal itself. The desert seemed to hold its breath again, the sun blazing, heat shimmering, sand drifting over the distant targets. The chief understood, with sudden clarity, that he was standing at the edge of witnessing something extraordinary, something that would challenge every expectation he had ever held about snipers, skill, and human capability. And as she raised the rifle once more, adjusting for the next shot, a ripple of tension passed through the range. Every eye followed her. Every heartbeat synchronized to her movements. Every operator, including the chief, knew that what came next could redefine everything they thought was possible. Because at that moment, in the Nevada desert under the blistering sun, one truth became clear. This was no ordinary marksman. This was a force of nature, a sniper whose skill had been honed in shadows, calibrated in necessity, and refined to the point where distance, probability, and human limitation ceased to matter. And the first whispers of legend, the 3,247-meter kill, lingered in the air, a tantalizing hint that the desert was about to tell a story unlike any the SEAL chief had ever heard. The sun had climbed higher, its brutal light casting sharp shadows across the Nevada desert. The heat shimmered over the cracked earth like a living veil, twisting the horizon, turning the distant mountains into mirages. The SEAL chief stood slightly apart from the other trainees, his arms crossed, watching. He had seen a lot in his career: skilled marksmen, legendary snipers, and operators who could perform in impossible conditions. But what he was witnessing now was unlike anything he had ever encountered. She adjusted the Barrett .50, her movements deliberate, precise, fluid. The rifle, massive and unforgiving in the hands of most, seemed to obey her as if it were an extension of her own body. Her breathing remained slow, almost meditative despite the heat, the observers, and the distance. Every muscle was taut but controlled, every decision calculated down to fractions of a millimeter. The chief's mind raced. If she can hit 1,800 meters like it's a warm-up, how far does this go? He had heard whispers among his own team, stories of impossible shots in the field, bullets traveling over 2,500 meters. But they were always cloaked in rumor, dismissed as exaggeration. And yet here she was, standing calm as if distance were irrelevant. The next set of targets had been moved to 2,500 meters, barely visible, tiny dots that most operators wouldn't even attempt without sophisticated wind data, a laser rangefinder, and multiple spotters. Most men at this range would sweat, curse, and misfire, or fail completely. But she didn't flinch. She crouched behind the barricade, elbows resting in the sand, scope rising to her eye with the ease of someone picking up a pen. The chief stepped closer, his boots sinking slightly into the soft desert sand. "I've trained snipers for decades," he murmured to himself, more as an affirmation than a statement. "Few could hit this at half this distance, and you're about to do it clean." Her gloved hands danced over the adjustments of the scope, elevation, windage, parallax, all almost imperceptible movements but each critical. She was not guessing. She was calculating, measuring, compensating. The desert was alive under her gaze, the gusts of wind, the shimmer of heat, the subtle movement of the earth under the sun, all factors she had already considered. "Remember, this is 2,500 meters, one of the junior instructors muttered nervously. Most experienced snipers would need 3 or 4 tries to even get close. She didn't respond. Her focus was absolute, a tunnel through which nothing else existed. The desert, the sun, the dust, the skeptics, all vanished. Only the rifle, the target, and her calculations remained. The chief held his breath. The rifle barked, the sound detonating across the desert with deafening authority. Dust erupted around the target as the steel plate rang sharply, echoing back like a victory bell. Dead center. A collective gasp rose from the observers. Mouths hung open. The trainees stumbled backward, muttering disbelief. Even the seasoned SEALs exchanged glances of awe. The chief felt a mixture of admiration and unease. He had seen skilled operators, but few could command a weapon at this distance with such terrifying precision. She lowered the rifle, dusting the barrel lightly. "Next," she said, almost casually, her voice calm but measured. Her eyes scanned the horizon. The next challenge, too, 800 meters. The air shimmered with heat, warping the sightlines, making visual identification a challenge for anyone who lacked her uncanny focus. The chief took a step closer, compelled by curiosity he hadn't felt in years. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked quietly, though part of him feared the answer. He had trained countless snipers, but none had ever shown skill this refined, this surgical, this inhumanly precise. She hesitated only for a heartbeat, the first crack of hesitation he had seen. Then she exhaled slowly, almost as if releasing a memory, and replied, "Experience." "Experience," he repeated, incredulous. "At this level, you can't just experience your way to this." Her eyes flicked to his, and he saw a shadow there, a darkness that had nothing to do with arrogance or bravado. It was history. It was necessity. It was the weight of survival measured in meters, seconds, and lives. "Experience," she said again, quieter, "is just a word for what happens when you survive long enough to learn the truth." The chief's stomach tightened. He knew instinctively that her path had been forged in fire, in situations where failure was fatal, where mistakes were counted in deaths rather than embarrassment. He didn't push further. Some stories weren't told. Not yet. The next shot loomed. 2,800 meters. The rifle was massive, heavy, and merciless. Most operators would hesitate. Most would curse their own pulse, sweat, and trembling hands. But she crouched, adjusted her scope, and breathed in a rhythm that seemed almost synchronized with the desert itself. Time slowed. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind gusted, waiting for the inevitable. She fired. The shot rang across the canyon, echoing into the mountains. The steel target shuddered violently, ringing a crisp, impossible clang. Dead center. The chief felt a chill run down his spine. He had trained for precision, for distance, for hours in extreme conditions. He had been near perfection himself. And yet, here she was, seemingly effortless, conquering distances that had once been considered mythical. One of the instructors whispered, almost reverently, I've never seen anything like this. Never." The chief's eyes narrowed. He had heard rumors, the whispers about her legendary 3,247-meter shot, but hearing them repeated now, seeing them play out in real time, sent a shockwave through his mind. This wasn't just skill. This was mastery bordering on myth. She lowered the rifle slowly, her face unreadable. The desert sun reflected off the scope, blinding in brilliance. She didn't smile, didn't boast. She just scanned the horizon, calculating, observing, preparing. Her calm was unnerving. She exuded confidence, but it wasn't arrogance. It was control, total control. The chief's respect for her deepened, but so did his unease. There was more here than anyone could see, more than the Barrett, more than the distance, more than the impossible shots. There was history. There were stories that hadn't been told. And he had a growing certainty that the 3,247-meter shot wasn't just a number. It was a moment that defined her, a mission, a necessity, and a past no one had glimpsed. The other trainees whispered amongst themselves, fear and awe mingling in their voices. One of them muttered, "Do you realize what 3,247 meters means? That's insane, almost impossible." The chief's jaw tightened. "Not impossible," he muttered almost to himself, "not for her." She glanced at him then, almost knowingly. A faint smirk brushed the corner of her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. Those eyes, calm yet haunted, told stories of survival, of battles fought in shadows, of lives saved and lost by her single, unwavering shot. And then she turned back to the horizon. There was a hint of anticipation, a quiet warning that this was only the beginning. The desert seemed alive around her, waiting to see if anyone else could even hope to match her skill. The chief realized in that moment that he wasn't just witnessing training. He was witnessing a legend in motion. A sniper whose reach extended farther than most could imagine, whose focus and skill had been honed under conditions that would have crushed most men. And the whispers of 3,247 meters were not just rumor. They were the key to understanding her, if he could ever learn the truth. He took a deep breath, a mixture of respect and apprehension settling over him. She had shattered expectations, and now he was desperate to understand the full story, how far her talent truly extended and what had forged it. Because when she finally lowered the Barrett .50, calm as ever, he knew with certainty that she had not yet revealed the full measure of her power. And whatever came next, whatever history and skill lay behind that legendary 3,247-meter shot, would not just amaze him. It would demand his complete attention, his respect, and perhaps even his caution. The desert held its silence once more, the targets shimmering in the heat, and the chief realized this was only the beginning. And the next chapter, the true revelation of her mastery, was looming just over the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly, heat waves blurring the horizon, shimmering off the distant steel targets like ghosts. The SEAL chief stood slightly apart, watching her with a mix of awe and disbelief. Every shot she took seemed to erase the limits of possibility. He had trained hundreds of snipers in his career, men and women alike, yet none had ever displayed a mastery so precise it bordered on preternatural. She had just hit targets at 2,800 meters, dead center, flawless, as if the laws of physics bent themselves to her will. Whispers began to ripple through the mess hall later that afternoon. Trainees and instructors alike huddled together, voices low and conspiratorial. Someone mentioned her record shot, a figure so extreme it sounded like legend. 3,247 meters. The SEAL chief froze mid-sip of his coffee, a chill crawling up his spine. He had heard the numbers in passing, dismissed them as myth, impossible even under optimal conditions. Yet he had just witnessed her defy the odds at nearly comparable distances, and doubt began to crumble. He set his cup down with deliberate care and leaned against the wall, absorbing the room's low murmurings. Each mention of the number made his pulse tighten. 3,247 meters, that's insane. Beyond any conventional marksmanship. Beyond logic. Finally, he found himself unable to resist. He walked through the throng of trainees, cutting a path to her. She was sitting quietly in a corner, barrel of the Barrett resting against the table beside her, as if the weapon itself understood the tension in the room. She didn't glance up. She didn't need to. The chief could feel the weight of her focus even without seeing her eyes. 3,247 meters, he said quietly, almost a challenge. Is that real? She finally lifted her gaze, calm and unwavering. Her eyes held an unsettling clarity as if she could see straight through him and the desert itself. It's real, she said simply. No exaggeration, no embellishment. Just a quiet affirmation, as matter of fact as telling someone the sun was setting. The chief's breath caught. You're saying you've hit a target over 3 kilometers away. With that rifle, he gestured toward the Barrett, now resting casually on the table. She nodded. Exactly. The chief's mind raced. He had trained the best snipers the Navy had to offer. He had seen men hit targets at distances that pushed physics, relying on calculators, laser rangefinders, weather data, and sometimes sheer luck. But a shot at 3,247 meters, that was more than mastery, it was near legend. It required not only perfect skill, but near superhuman calculation, nerves of steel, and intuition honed under unimaginable conditions. Who trained you to do this? He asked, struggling to maintain his composure. His curiosity bordered on disbelief. Most people, he knew, learned to shoot within the limits of probability. Her probability had been rewritten. Not anyone, she said, her tone calm, almost detached. I learned it the hard way, one shot at a time. The chief felt a chill run down his spine. Her words hinted at experience beyond the training range. There were shadows there, moments in the past where her skill had been forged under pressure, necessity, and danger. He understood immediately that she wasn't talking about targets in the desert. She was talking about survival, about life and death situations that had sculpted her precision and her composure. He sat down across from her, unable to contain his curiosity. You're telling me you've been in situations where one shot, one mistake, could cost lives? She nodded, eyes fixed on some distant point he couldn't see. Every mission, every deployment, there comes a moment where the margin for error disappears, where your skills are the difference between life and death. That's where I learned, not in classrooms, not in drills, real situations. The chief's mind flashed through his own years in combat. The countless operations where decisions had to be instantaneous, where nerves had to remain calm under impossible stress. He had trained people for decades, but nothing had prepared him for someone whose baseline for calm was a battlefield-grade serenity. The room around them seemed to fade into background noise. Other operators whispered in awe about her feats, but the chief's focus narrowed entirely on her. There was a haunted edge to her calm, a weight that spoke of experiences he couldn't begin to imagine. And the number 247 meters, hung in his mind like a ghost. It wasn't just a measurement, it was a story, a testament, and a warning. He leaned forward. You said it was necessity, what do you mean? She glanced at him, the corners of her mouth lifting faintly. Sometimes the shot has to be made whether you want to make it or not. Sometimes there's no second chance. If you hesitate, people die. The chief felt a tightening in his chest. He knew that reality, but hearing it from her, delivered in that quiet, matter-of-fact way, made the distance of 3,247 meters suddenly tangible. She had done more than push limits. She had operated in conditions where failure was final. Where did this happen? He asked, his voice low, almost reverent. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the horizon, eyes narrowing as if recalling something too distant to speak aloud. Somewhere far from here, she said finally. A place where the air is thin, the wind unpredictable, and every calculation is survival. Her words were deliberate but haunting. The chief realized that what she had achieved wasn't just technical, it was personal, forged under conditions that most would never endure. Her skill was built on necessity, on life-or-death decisions, and on a past she clearly carried with her. 3,247 meters, he murmured almost to himself. That's not just impossible, that's insane. I've trained snipers my whole career, and even the best would struggle to come close. She shrugged, but there was a subtle steel in her posture, a reminder that she had lived through conditions where struggle wasn't an option, it was survival. It's only impossible if you refuse to understand the variables, she said softly. If you respect the rifle, the environment, and yourself, then distance becomes just another number. The chief studied her. There was a combination of brilliance and danger there, the quiet aura of someone who had mastered both weapon and self under extraordinary circumstances. He realized that this wasn't just training. She was a living lesson in precision, focus, and the brutal calculus of necessity. And yet, despite her composure, he could sense the weight of her past pressing down. There was a hint of shadow behind her eyes, a quiet gravity that spoke of missions, decisions, and experiences that were far darker than the range or desert could ever reveal. The chief swallowed hard, understanding that the story of her legendary 3,247-meter shot was more than a measure of skill. It was a fragment of a life lived on the edge of possibility and danger. And he knew, instinctively, that the rest of the story, what had forged that shot, what had taught her to calculate and survive at the limits of physics, was something he might not be prepared to witness. The desert wind stirred, rattling the edges of the Humvees and kicking up dust into the sunlight. Outside, targets shimmered in the heat, each one a silent reminder of the distance she had mastered. The other operators watched her, their awe palpable, but the chief's attention was fixed entirely on her. He understood now that the 3,247-meter shot wasn't just about skill. It was a glimpse into history, into the shadowed path of a sniper who had been shaped by extreme circumstances. And as she lowered the Barrett .50, calm and unreadable, he realized that what came next, what she was about to reveal about herself and her past, would change everything he thought he knew about snipers, skill, and human capability. Because legends aren't born, they're forged. And in the desert heat under the blazing sun, one SEAL chief understood that he was standing on the threshold of witnessing a legend in motion, a story written in meters, seconds, and survival. The sun had begun its slow descent, stretching long shadows across the desert floor. Dust danced in the fading light, drifting in eddies over the distant steel targets. The SEAL chief remained by the Humvee, arms folded, watching her. She was calm, as if the extreme distance of her shots, the unblinking eyes of observers, and the suffocating desert heat were trivial obstacles in her daily routine. Yet beneath that calm, the chief sensed something else. A shadow, a history folded into her movements, a discipline carved from fire. After the final long-distance target had been cleared, she packed up the Barrett .50 with methodical efficiency, loading it into the Humvee as though it were a rifle she had carried thousands of times before. The other trainees lingered, whispering rumors of her legendary feats, but the chief wanted more than whispers. He wanted truth. He approached carefully, his voice low, respectful, but insistent. "You've done things most people can't even imagine. Missions, shots, situations I don't even want to guess at. You owe me, the team, the story behind all this. How did you get to this level?" Her eyes flicked toward him, calculating, as if measuring whether he was ready for the answer. The desert wind tugged at her hair, and for a heartbeat she didn't respond. Then finally she spoke. "I learned in places no training manual would ever prepare you for," she said softly. Her tone carried weight, a gravity that suggested a history heavy with decisions no one should have to make. In deserts far hotter than this one, on mountains where oxygen is a luxury, in cities where every shadow could kill you, I learned that a bullet can save lives, or take them, and if you hesitate even for a fraction of a second, it's over. The chief listened, rapt. Years in combat had taught him to read between lines, to hear truths hidden in what someone didn't say. He felt the tension in her words. The calmness wasn't arrogance, it was survival. Every move, every calculation, every perfect shot was the result of life-and-death lessons no one else had endured. "Tell me," he said carefully, "your legendary shot, the 3,247-meter one, how did it happen?" Her eyes darkened, staring into the fading horizon as if recalling a memory too sharp to touch. "It wasn't for training, it wasn't for glory, it was for necessity," she said. Her voice, calm as ever, betrayed a hint of strain, a reminder that some things remained etched in memory like scars. "We were pinned down in hostile territory. My team's survival depended on a single shot. The coordinates, wind, mirage, everything had to be calculated perfectly. One mistake, and we wouldn't have made it out alive." The chief's chest tightened. He had experienced high-stakes operations, yet her story sounded almost otherworldly. A sniper capable of extreme calculations under unimaginable pressure, every variable a matter of life or death. And she had done it. Alone. "Your team, you saved them?" he asked, though he felt the answer was already embedded in her tone. She nodded, but the nod was heavy with unspoken cost. "We survived, but it wasn't without consequences. Every shot has a shadow, every mission leaves traces." He studied her, noticing subtle tension in her hands, the faint scar along her cheek catching the dying sunlight. She hadn't been reckless. She hadn't been lucky. She had been precise, methodical, lethal, and yet something in her past weighed on her even now. "Most snipers I know," he said, keeping his tone neutral, "practice for years under controlled conditions. You've operated under fire at distances that would break most men's nerves. How do you keep so calm?" Her gaze met his, steady, almost haunting. "You learn to silence doubt," she said. "You train it out of yourself, but it doesn't leave you. It follows you like a shadow. That's why preparation is everything, and every shot is remembered." The chief leaned back, absorbing her words. He realized that her calmness wasn't innate, it was forged, tempered, hard-won. And yet, even tempered steel has cracks. He sensed them in the way her eyes occasionally flicked toward the horizon, as if calculating threats that weren't there or remembering threats that could never leave. The young trainees, meanwhile, continued to whisper among themselves. Rumors flew about her legendary abilities, but the chief ignored them. He was focused entirely on her, on understanding the force of nature standing before him. This wasn't just skill, it was a lifetime of necessity, of survival at the extremes of human capability. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked again. "You're not just a marksman, you're a weapon in yourself." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "There are places you don't talk about, missions you don't discuss. The desert, mountains, cities in conflict, that's where you learn if you survive long enough. You calculate, you shoot, you move, you survive. And every mistake teaches you something lethal." The chief nodded, understanding without needing details. He had lived it himself, seen the cost of error, the stakes of precision, the unforgiving calculus of life and death. But watching her, he realized that she had endured conditions most operators couldn't imagine. And she had done it with a level of mastery that redefined everything he thought possible. "You've saved lives and lost some along the way," he said quietly. "I can see it in your eyes." She glanced down just briefly as if acknowledging the truth of it. "Yes, and you never forget those moments. They don't leave you. You carry them into every shot, every mission, every calculation. And sometimes the shadows they leave, they follow you home." The chief felt a deep, unshakable respect settle over him. She was more than a sniper. She was a survivor, a strategist, a warrior whose calm exterior belied the storms she had weathered. Every shot she took, every movement she made was informed by battles most people couldn't imagine. And yet, despite all that weight, she had maintained her precision, her focus, and her extraordinary skill. He reached for a coffee cup and swirled the bitter liquid, reflecting on her words. "The 3,247-meter shot," he said softly. That number isn't just impressive, it's legendary. But now I understand it's not just about the distance, it's about everything you learn to survive and protect your team. Her lips curved faintly. Exactly. People focus on the number, but it was more than that. It was preparation, calculation, courage, necessity, and the memory of those you fight for. That's what makes the impossible possible. The chief's gaze lingered on her, realizing that she was a living testament to resilience, skill, and extreme focus. He understood at last that this was more than training or practice. It was a lifetime of trials, of decisions made under pressure, of survival distilled into a single, lethal precision. And yet, even as he absorbed the magnitude of her skills, a part of him couldn't help but wonder about the untold parts of her story. The missions she didn't describe, the threats she never named, the distances she hadn't yet revealed. The shadow of her past loomed large, silent, but undeniable, promising that her journey and her mastery were far from fully understood. She stood then, gathering her equipment, every movement precise, controlled, and deliberate. The SEAL chief followed her gaze to the horizon, sensing that the desert had more tests in store. He realized that the story behind the Barrett .50, the legendary 3,247-meter shot, and the warrior herself was still unfolding. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a crucible of heat, light, and impossible distances. And in that crucible, he understood that he was standing beside a legend, one forged in shadows, tempered by survival, and defined by mastery at the edge of human capability. But the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The chief knew, instinctively, that whatever came next would reveal more than skill. It would reveal history, sacrifice, and the true cost of the precision she wielded like a weapon. And the desert, silent and watchful, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Because some legends are measured not just in meters or shots, but in the shadows they leave behind, and the lives they touch along the way. The sun had dropped low, casting long amber streaks across the desert floor. The heat still clung to the cracked earth, radiating off the steel targets in wavering waves. The SEAL chief watched from the edge of the range, a mixture of awe and apprehension tightening his chest. He had seen marksmen in action, even the elite, but what he was witnessing now was on another plane entirely. She stood alone at the firing line, the Barrett .50 resting lightly in her hands, almost as if it weighed nothing. The extreme distance test was designed to push the boundaries, 3,000 meters and beyond, under harsh, variable conditions that would unnerve even the most experienced sniper. The other trainees had already faltered, their weapons trembling, their confidence cracking under the oppressive heat, wind, and the shimmering mirage that distorted their perception of the targets. Most of them had given up, muttering excuses or collapsing in frustration. Not her. She crouched, scoped the far-off targets, and began her calculations. The wind gusted, shifting sand and bending the light. Heat waves warped the horizon like ripples over water. At this distance, a fraction of a degree misalignment would be catastrophic. Yet she remained calm, controlled, composed, a picture of surgical focus. The chief's pulse quickened. He had trained for this, prepared operators for high-stakes calculations at extreme distances. And yet, her ease, her precision, her almost unnatural calm unsettled him. She was in a zone no one else could enter, a world where only calculation, instinct, and history intersected. The first shot echoed across the canyon, thunderous and commanding. The distant steel target quivered under the impact, ringing a sharp metallic clang. Dead center. A ripple of disbelief went through the observers. The chief's eyebrows lifted. He had trained snipers who struggled to hit targets at 1,500 meters. She had just shattered all expectations at over 3,000, and she hadn't even broken a sweat. The wind shifted again, gusting more violently now. The mirage danced over the targets, bending reality, threatening to deceive anyone lacking experience and nerve. She adjusted the scope imperceptibly, recalculating the trajectory with a flick of her gloved fingers. Her breathing remained steady. Her focus was unbreakable. "Next target, 3,100 meters," one of the instructors muttered under his breath. Most operators didn't even attempt shots beyond 2,500 meters under these conditions. The heat, the wind, the distortion, all combined to make the odds insurmountable. She didn't flinch, she didn't hesitate. She adjusted her aim and fired again. The shot rang out, echoing across the mountains like a cannon. The steel target shuddered violently, ringing perfectly, dead center. The chief's jaw tightened. It was more than skill. It was precision forged by experience under the harshest circumstances imaginable. He realized something then. This was not a display of casual competence. This was the result of countless hours under fire, countless moments where hesitation meant death. Every calculation, every micro-adjustment, every heartbeat had been honed in conditions that most men couldn't survive. She lowered the rifle and surveyed the range, her expression calm but intense. The other trainees whispered among themselves, eyes wide with disbelief, but the chief remained focused on her. He wanted to know more about the missions, the conditions, the experiences that had sculpted her unparalleled skill. He approached her slowly. "You've hit targets most operators wouldn't dare attempt. How do you maintain composure under this kind of pressure?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the horizon, her eyes narrowing as if recalling distant deserts, high mountains, urban rooftops under fire. "You learn to embrace the pressure," she said finally. "It becomes a part of you. Every mission, every shot, every variable, you carry it with you until it's second nature. Hesitation is death. Confidence, precision. That's the difference." Her words were calm, almost serene, but the chief felt the weight behind them. He had trained under pressure himself, but this was another level entirely. She had been forged in fire, sharpened by necessity, and tempered by circumstances few could survive. "Your legendary shot, the 3,247-meter kill," he said quietly. "That wasn't training, that wasn't practice, that was real." Her gaze darkened briefly as if the memory was still fresh and sharp. It was necessity. There were no second chances. One mistake, one miscalculation, and people would have died. Her voice was steady, but it carried a subtle gravity that made the chief's pulse quicken. He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. She didn't just wield skill. She carried the weight of life and death, of missions executed flawlessly under impossible conditions. Every shot she had taken was informed by experience, precision, and necessity, not ego or display. The range officers set up the final extreme target, 3,247 meters. The number hovered in the desert heat like a legend waiting to be tested. Most of the observers fell silent, their disbelief palpable. Even the chief felt a tightening in his chest. She crouched behind the barricade, adjusting the scope, factoring in wind, mirage, and every subtle variable. The desert seemed to bend around her focus, the heat and distance irrelevant. Time slowed, heartbeats synchronized. The SEAL chief realized that she was performing a calculation no one else could comprehend. The shot rang out. The sound thundered across the canyon, echoing against the distant mountains. A small steel target shuddered violently and rang perfectly, dead center. The impossibility of it made the desert itself seem to pause. The chief's mind raced. He had heard rumors, whispers of the shot's existence, but seeing it executed flawlessly was a revelation. She wasn't just skilled, she was a living legend, capable of feats few could even imagine. She lowered the rifle slowly, exuding calm mastery. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, hinted at experience beyond the range, beyond training, beyond human expectation. The chief approached her, voice low, almost reverent. "You did it. 3,247 meters, exactly as the legend said." She gave a small nod, but her gaze returned to the horizon. "The distance is meaningless if the shot isn't necessary," she said quietly. What matters is why it was taken and who you fight for. That's what shapes the skill, the precision, the calm. The chief absorbed her words, understanding finally that this was more than a demonstration. This was a lesson in life and death, in focus, in the crucible of necessity. Her calm wasn't arrogance, it was survival distilled into perfection. He realized something else too. The story behind that shot, the missions, the experiences, the shadows she carried, those were far from finished. He sensed that she had endured more than anyone could imagine, and that her mastery had been forged in circumstances most operators would never survive. The desert wind stirred, lifting sand into long, shimmering trails. The extreme test was over, but the legend had only deepened. The chief knew that the story behind her extraordinary skill, the full measure of the sniper who had executed the impossible 3,247-meter kill, was yet to be revealed. And he understood, with a certainty that made his chest tighten, that he was witnessing not just training or skill, but history in motion. A warrior whose precision had been forged under the most extreme circumstances, and whose shadowed past carried lessons that could reshape everything he thought he knew about snipers, skill, and survival. The desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next revelation. The chief knew that whatever came next would not just test skill, it would test courage, endurance, and understanding of a past written in distance, danger, and necessity. Because the story of the 3,247-meter shot was more than just a number. It was survival, mastery, and a shadowed history that had yet to be fully revealed. And the SEAL chief knew, instinctively, that he was standing on the edge of witnessing something far larger than skill alone. He was witnessing a living legend. The desert was quiet now, the long shadows of late afternoon stretching across the sand like dark fingers. The SEAL chief followed her slowly toward the Humvee, the weight of everything he had witnessed pressing on him. She moved with a purposeful calm, as though the scorching desert and the extreme distances she had just conquered were trivial compared to what she had endured before. "Tell me about it," he said finally, breaking the silence. "The missions, the operations that made you this." His voice was low, careful. He didn't want to startle her, but he needed to understand. She glanced at him, her eyes unreadable. For a moment there was hesitation, a flicker of something hidden deep inside, memory, regret, survival. Then, as though a switch had been flipped, she began to speak. "I've operated in places that don't exist on any map," she said. Her tone was flat, almost clinical, but the edge beneath it spoke of danger. Deserts with heat that could melt metal, mountains where oxygen is a gift, cities where every shadow conceals a threat. I've watched people die because they hesitated, because they miscalculated, because they weren't ready. And I learned that hesitation is a luxury you cannot afford. The chief listened intently, feeling the tension in her words. He had been in combat, faced extreme situations, but her calm authority and the precision behind it hinted at experiences far beyond his imagination. Every shot she had taken today, every calculation, every whisper of wind she had measured, it all had a history, a crucible in which her extraordinary skill had been forged. "You survived?" he asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. "I did," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "But not without cost. Every mission leaves a mark. Some leave scars on the body, others leave scars here." She tapped her temple gently just above her brow. "Every target, every shot, every decision, it stays with you. You carry it into every calculation, every mission." The chief's stomach tightened. He had always known the psychological toll of combat, the weight of life and death decisions. But hearing it from her, knowing the precision and composure required to make impossible shots, made it real in a way he hadn't experienced. "Tell me about your most dangerous mission," he pressed, his curiosity overtaking caution. She hesitated, glancing toward the distant horizon. For a heartbeat the desert seemed to shrink around them, the heat and distance forgotten. "There was one," she said quietly. "Urban terrain, hostile territory. My team was pinned down by insurgents who had us cornered. Extraction was impossible. Every second counted, and every move could be our last. Her words were precise, almost surgical. The chief felt the tension in them, imagined the stakes, and shivered. He had been in firefights, had trained operators under pressure, but the thought of being trapped, outnumbered, and relying on a single shot to survive, it was almost unbearable. I took the shot, she continued, her voice steady but edged with the memory of danger. 3,247 meters. One bullet calculated for wind, elevation, mirage, and gravity. One shot to ensure my team's survival. It was more than skill. It was necessity. And it worked. We survived. The chief's mind struggled to process the enormity of what she had just said. This wasn't just the range. This wasn't practice. This was a mission in which lives depended on her precision, her calculations, and her nerve. She had turned myth into reality. "And the rest?" he asked, the question heavy in the fading sunlight. She exhaled slowly, as if releasing a shadow she had carried for years. "We made it out," she said, voice quiet but firm. "But every mission leaves its mark. I've seen friends fall, allies vanish, lives ended because of one miscalculation. That's why I practice, why I prepare, why I push myself beyond limits. Precision isn't just skill, it's survival. And sometimes it's the only difference between life and death." The chief's eyes met hers. He had trained operators, seen exceptional skill, but this combination of calm, calculation, and experience under extreme conditions was unprecedented. He realized that the range, the distance, the legendary 3,247-meter shot, it was all part of a larger story, a history forged in shadows and necessity. She packed the Barrett .50 carefully, her movements deliberate, controlled. Every gesture spoke of experience, of discipline, of countless missions where failure was fatal. The chief followed her gaze to the horizon, understanding that she had faced dangers most could not comprehend. "Do you ever doubt?" he asked softly. "Do you ever feel fear?" She paused, considering the question. Then quietly she said, "Fear is always there. It's part of the calculation. It sharpens you. But it doesn't control you. Control comes from preparation, from knowing your weapon, your environment, your team, and from knowing that hesitation is death." The chief swallowed hard. He had trained under pressure, understood fear, but her mastery, honed through missions that pushed physics and probability to the edge, redefined it entirely. He realized that her calm was not absence of fear. It was mastery over it, distilled through experience and necessity. 3,247 meters, he said quietly, almost reverently. That shot, it wasn't just skill, it was history. She nodded, her eyes flicking briefly to the horizon. "History," she said softly, "and survival. Every shot is a story, every target a lesson. That one saved lives. And every day since, it reminds me that preparation, calculation, and courage are everything." The chief felt the weight of her words settle over him. He had trained legends, but this was different. She wasn't just a sniper. She was a living lesson in focus, precision, and survival under conditions most could not imagine. The desert wind stirred, lifting sand into long, drifting trails. The sun was low now, casting deep shadows over the range. And as she stood there, Barrett .50 slung casually over her shoulder, the chief realized something profound. He was not just witnessing skill, he was witnessing a life forged in the crucible of danger, a story written in bullets, calculation, and survival. The young trainees whispered among themselves, still awestruck, but the chief ignored them. His attention was entirely on her. Every movement, every word, every breath hinted at experiences beyond the desert range, missions, calculations, and moments where failure was not an option. "Why show us this?" he asked finally. "Why demonstrate it now?" She glanced at him, eyes steady, almost challenging. "Because the future depends on understanding," she said. "Understanding what's possible, understanding what precision, preparation, and courage can achieve. and sometimes it's necessary to show the next generation that limits are meant to be tested and broken. The chief nodded slowly. He had trained operators for decades, instilled discipline, pushed limits, but she had redefined the very concept of what was achievable. She had turned legend into reality and history into lessons for survival and skill. The desert seemed to pause with them, holding its breath. The legend of the 3,247-meter shot was no longer just a number. It was a story, a history, a measure of survival under extreme conditions. And the chief knew with unshakable certainty that he was standing beside someone who had walked through fire, lived to tell the story, and emerged not just unbroken but transcendent. But even as he absorbed the magnitude of her story, he sensed more remained hidden, missions not yet revealed, dangers not yet spoken, and experiences that had forged her calm into a weapon. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the promise of more revelations, more shadows, and the untold story behind the sniper who had achieved the impossible. The SEAL chief knew one thing clearly: the full measure of her skill, the depth of her experience, and the history of the 3,247-meter shot had not yet been fully revealed. And when it was, it would not only astonish him, it would challenge everything he thought he knew about snipers, precision, and survival. And the desert waited, silent and vast, as though anticipating the final chapter of a story still unfolding in shadows, calculation, and extraordinary courage. The sun had almost disappeared behind the jagged Nevada horizon, leaving the desert awash in crimson and gold. Shadows stretched long and eerie, twisting over the cracked earth, the steel targets and the Humvees. The SEAL chief stood slightly apart, heart pounding, fully aware that what he was about to witness would redefine everything he thought he knew about snipers, skill, and survival. She crouched at the firing line one last time. The Barrett .50 rested in her hands, calm and precise, as if it were an extension of her very body. The extreme test had ended, yet this final shot wasn't for training, not for demonstration. This was personal. This was history. The chief had watched her all day, seen her defy every limit, hit targets others deemed impossible, and maintain a calm that was almost supernatural. But now, there was a subtle shift in her focus, a quiet intensity that spoke of stakes far higher than a range or observation. "Tell me why," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "Tell me the full story behind the 3,247-meter shot." Her eyes narrowed, fixed on some invisible horizon, recalling a memory sharper than any desert mirage. "It wasn't just a shot," she said softly. "It was survival. It was my team. It was everything I had trained for, everything I had learned, and everything I had carried from missions that almost ended in death." The chief's chest tightened. He could sense it, the gravity behind those words, the echo of moments no one else had survived. He knew instinctively that she had walked through fire and lived to tell it. She took a deep breath and began, her voice calm, measured, but carrying the weight of countless untold experiences. "We were on a mission in hostile territory, miles from extraction. The enemy had pinned us down in an open area, snipers, militants, and surveillance covering every route. One wrong move and my team would have been annihilated. Every calculation had to be perfect. Every second mattered." The chief leaned in, the desert wind tugging at his uniform, the temperature dropping as twilight settled. Every detail she spoke of painted a picture of life-and-death precision, the type of scenarios that few would ever survive, let alone master. "They relied on me," she continued, her eyes steady yet haunted. "Not just to hit the target, but to anticipate the variables no one else could see. The wind, the mirage, the angle. I had to account for every factor across over 3 kilometers. One shot and the survival of my team depended on it. One shot and failure meant death." He felt a chill despite the lingering desert heat. He had trained operators, men and women who could hit targets under stress, but the stakes she described were beyond anything he had prepared for. The magnitude of her skill was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and tactical, honed through experience in shadows most people would never glimpse. The shot, she said, lowering her voice, was calculated for hours in the field. Every micro-adjustment, every breath, every heartbeat was accounted for, and when I fired, it was perfect. The target went down exactly as predicted. My team survived, and the enemy never knew what hit them. The chief swallowed hard. He had heard whispers of the 3,247-meter shot, dismissed them as legend. But now, hearing the story from her, seeing her precision, understanding her mind, it was real. Every impossible rumor, every whispered tale was grounded in fact. She had not just achieved a feat of skill. She had achieved survival against impossible odds. And that's why, he began cautiously, you can handle any target, any distance with such calm. She nodded slowly, her gaze distant, lost in the memory. Because every shot I take now is built on the ones that mattered. Every shot is calculated with the knowledge that hesitation costs lives. Every mission I've survived, every team I've protected has trained me for this moment. That's why I am precise. That's why I am calm. And that's why the impossible is just another number to me. The chief's respect deepened into awe. He had trained the elite, taught precision under extreme conditions, and yet she stood apart, more than skill, more than training. She was a living testament to human capability, forged in fire, survival, and necessity. He noticed her eyes flick to the horizon, then back to the targets. The desert around them seemed to still, as if anticipating what would come next. There was a sense that the story was nearing its climax. The demonstration, the history, the legend were about to merge into a single, undeniable truth. "Show me," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Show me the shot that made history." She nodded, stepping forward with deliberate calm. The steel target at 3,247 meters shimmered in the twilight heat, small but precise. The chief could see the mirage distorted, could imagine the tiny adjustments necessary to hit it at that distance. Most men would hesitate. Most men would fail. Not her. She crouched, scope rising to her eye, every breath measured, every muscle in tension and control. Her gloved fingers adjusted elevation and windage, subtle movements almost imperceptible. Time seemed to slow. The desert held its breath. Even the wind waited. She fired. The sound of the Barrett echoed across the mountains, a thunderclap that shook the horizon. Dust erupted around the target. The steel plate shuddered, rang perfectly. Dead center. The chief's breath caught. Every trainee, every observer froze. They had watched legend unfold. They had watched history executed in a single, precise moment. The impossible had been realized before their eyes. She lowered the rifle slowly, the calm in her posture almost eerie. She didn't smile. She didn't boast. She simply stood, a figure of control and mastery, embodying every ounce of training, experience, and survival she had endured. The chief stepped closer, feeling the enormity of what he had just witnessed. I don't even have words," he said quietly. That's history. That's beyond what anyone could teach. That's you." She glanced at him, eyes calm but unreadable. "It's not about me," she said softly. "It's about preparation, precision, and necessity. Every shot I've taken was built on lessons learned in places no one would survive. The number is just a measurement. The meaning is life or death." The chief nodded, understanding finally. The legend of the 3,247-meter shot wasn't just about distance. It was about the life-and-death calculus, the missions in shadows, the experience that sharpened mind and body to perfection. He realized that everything he had witnessed, from her control to her history, was proof of something rare, mastery forged in fire. The desert wind stirred, kicking up small clouds of sand around them. Twilight deepened, and the sky turned to deep indigo, flecked with the first stars. The SEAL chief looked at her, a profound respect etched into every line of his face. "You're remarkable," he said finally. Not just for the shot, not just for the skill, but for surviving, for mastering it all. She gave a slight nod, almost acknowledging his words, but there was a quiet humility in her posture. Her calm, her mastery, her legend, everything she embodied, was the result of necessity, survival, and an unbroken will forged in shadows most would never endure. The chief realized something then. Legends are not born, they are forged, in deserts, mountains, hostile cities, and life-or-death decisions. Every impossible shot, every survival instinct, every precision calculation, it all leads to the moment when skill, experience, and necessity converge. And here she was, standing before him, calm, precise, legendary. The impossible had been realized, the 3,247-meter shot no longer a myth, but a testament to human capability, resilience, and mastery. The desert held its silence, the stars appearing slowly overhead, witnesses to history, to precision, to survival. And the SEAL chief understood with a weighty certainty that he had not just observed a sniper, he had witnessed a living legend, a story forged in shadows and fire, whose mastery extended far beyond the limits of ordinary men. For her, the 3,247-meter shot was more than distance. It was history, it was life, it was survival, and it was a reminder that the impossible exists only until someone dares to achieve it. And she had dared.